Hi, my name is Mary Gibilisco and welcome to my studio. This particular course is designed for beginners and also for students that started in the middle. It's just a great course to go through step by step so that you can maybe perhaps fill in some of the blanks if you're not new to painting, or just start from the very beginning. In the very first lesson, what we're going to do is we're going to explore the forms, because what we paint actually is not the effect. We don't paint objects, we paint the effect of light on objects. So we're going to explore all of the different forms. We're going to explore the primary colors of red, yellow, and blue and put them together in a pleasing composition. And in our subsequent lessons, we will explore the secondary and the tertiary colors, and we will explore perspective, eye level, and what goes into making a proper floral portrait and a still life. But we have to start at the very beginning with surface preparation. So go ahead and start assembling your materials. You have a list of those, and let's get started on our journey into learning how to paint right from the start. I've assembled my supplies, and with any project, what's probably the most important is your foundation. And your foundation in painting is your background. So to start with, the actual background I'm using is a piece of masonite, also known as hardboard. I like to use masonite because it is stable, it's archival, and if you're using the Genesis heat set oils, it's impervious to the effects of the heat. So a good wood panel is fine. Canvas, avoid canvas panels. They're not archival, they'll start to fall apart, and maybe this will be a great painting, so you don't want to risk it. And so work with a good surface. Then what we have to do is we have to put down a ground, and the ground is something that's going to act as a barrier between the oil paint and our surface. Now you can put down gesso, but we're going to work with an acrylic ground that has color to it. I like to use the DecoArt brand, the Americana, because it's a true acrylic. It is not a latex as it's some of the other craft acrylics. So this is a good paint to work with, and I'm using desert sand. It's a nice, warm, neutral color. I have a roller brush. I hope yours looks a little bit better than mine, but mine is going to work just fine. It is a very soft poured roller. It doesn't have any nubs that you see perhaps on what you use on a wall. So have your supplies ready, and let's go ahead and start prepping. To prep the surface, I have rolled out onto a piece of palette paper my desert sand paint, and I'm going to fill my roller with this paint, and I'm going to fill it evenly. What you don't want to do is squirt this paint onto your surface. You want to put it on a piece of palette paper or a piece of paper, doesn't matter, so that you can fill the roller. Now I'm going to start to apply the paint to the surface using a fair amount of pressure to make the paint come off my roller. Rolling all different directions at this moment just to get the paint on the background. Now look for any impurities. If you see any impurities, any little chunks of dried acrylic, what you want to do is pull that out now. Now here's the important part. I have my paint on. Now, with no pressure at all, I'm coming back and I'm smoothing. I used a lot of pressure to get the paint off my roller, and now I'm just coming back and I'm smoothing. Because what you want with oil paint is you want just a little bit of tooth. You don't want extreme hills and valleys. You just want a little bit of tooth so that the oil paint will adhere. Let this dry thoroughly. You'll know it's dry when you touch it and it doesn't feel cold. Then come back and give it another coat. Just repeat what we just did. And then we'll be ready to start with the next step. These are the next set of supplies that you're going to need. You need a hard lead pencil, 2H, 4H in that range, an L square ruler, or just any kind of graph ruler that you might have, and then graphite. And graphite paper is what we will use to transfer the design onto the surface. So set aside your graphite paper, and what you're going to do is you also need a piece of tracing paper, and you're going to take your line drawing and you're going to trace it onto tracing paper. Any straight line, I would like for you to trace it using your ruler, and that way all of your straight lines will stay perfectly straight. Then, after you have your design traced, this is something that's very important in a still life, and this is called proving a design. This is why you do it in pencil. What you will do is you will fold your design in half with the pencil sides out, and your goal is to be sure that the symmetrical side stays symmetrical. I'm checking that the handles are exactly the same, and they're not. So I'm going to come in, you can use a regular eraser, but I have this battery operated one, so I'm going to use it. So I just erased the section on that handle that wasn't exactly the same as on the other side, and I'm retracing using the opposite side of the side that I liked to recreate the other handle. I'm checking that the lip of this crock is exactly the same on both sides. I'm checking that the side of the crock is exactly the same. Now the decoration, it can be asymmetrical because it wouldn't be absolutely perfect. Organic objects, such as the pear and the cherry, they're not symmetrical either, so don't worry about that. But go ahead and trace your design, and then fold it in half to be sure that the symmetrical sides match. And then we'll use this fold line in just a moment. I'm taking my line drawing and positioning it so it just fits on here comfortably side to side. You always want things to be off center, but considering that this is an asymmetrical overall line of design, you don't have to worry about that too much. So what you're going to do is you're going to use this fold line to be sure that your design is sitting on your surface straight. What I like to do is put one line on the bottom of the piece of masonite or my surface, and then take and maneuver my tracing until this tracing fold line lines up exactly with the side of the ruler. When I'm sure that I have it on there perfectly straight, another check, because this is an eye level still life, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to it, but all of our straight lines should form a right angle with the side of our surface. So now that I'm sure that this is on here straight, I'm just going to tape it down. And then I'll be able to go ahead and transfer. I'm using the gray graphite, and I'm going to transfer it very lightly. You could also use white graphite, but regardless, you want to press very lightly. Always check that you have the correct side down, because if you transfer this entire design and have it in backwards, it's very sad. I'm using a stylus. You could use a pen. You could use your pencil again. But I like to use the stylus because it makes for a very, very thin line. Now I hope you notice that I'm using a ruler, and the side is butted up against the side of my masonite. Then I'm sure I'm getting all these straight lines on perfectly straight. So I'm placing these straight lines first. Then I'll come back and do all of the other lines. Now this is where I usually give it a little check. Yes, it's transferring. That makes me happy. It's transferring very light. The upside of using a stylus is that the line is very, very thin. I remembered everything except for that little decoration line going across, so I'll just quickly place that on. Once your design is transferred, go ahead and set this aside and get out your paint and palette. For our mixing, what we need obviously is a palette, and this particular palette is a glass palette. And then we need a palette knife, and it should be a palette knife with a thin and flexible blade versus the palette knives that have the very large blade. If you have a thin blade, most of the paint ends up staying on the palette rather than on your knife. And then another thing that's very helpful, paper towels cut into small squares. And the reason why you cut them into small squares is because if you keep your paper towel as large as it comes off the roll, you get a little bit of paint on it, then you fold it, and then you have to throw it away. Or if you think, oh, that's such a big paper towel, I don't want to throw it away, then pretty soon what happens is you end up getting paint all over yourself. And so cut them in about 2-inch by 2-inch squares, and you'll be amazed how little paint you get on yourself, and you'll use just fewer paper towels. So let's start by mixing a value scale of gray. Put out about the size of a quarter of white. Now, anytime you go back into your pure colors, whether it's on your palette or on in the jars, take and wipe your knife off, and then your colors will stay pure. This is just a really good habit to get into. I'm putting out maybe about half as much of the black. And we're going to mix what's known as a value scale. And let's first define value. Value is how light or dark a color is. And it has nothing to do with the hue, also known as the color. It's just, is it a light color, a dark color? And working with just black and white, we'll be able to explore value. And we're going to mix 4 values of gray. So I'm putting a fair amount of white in the center of my palette. I'm not real big on keeping inside the squares, but you can do that if you want. Now I'm putting in just a little bit of the black, and I'm making a mid value. Now I do have some students that take and put a piece of paper underneath of the color of the project, and that's always a good thing to do. Then you'll know exactly what your colors will look like when they are on your surface. So I'm just mixing this mid value of gray using white and black, and I think that's going to be just fine. I'm going to take a portion of this and just really about 1/4 and move it up on my palette, because what I'd like to do is make a lighter value, and the lighter value will come by adding white. Notice that I have them right next to each other. They're not spread all over, and the reason for that is that it's a judgment, because values are in relationship to each other. So is this value lighter than this value? Yes, it is. Now if it were way over here, I probably wouldn't be able to tell that. Let's make a darker value. So I'm going to take, again, maybe about 1/4 and I'm going to add some black. And what you'll be amazed with when you do this type of painting is how little paint you actually need. Now this one is a little bit darker, and I'd like to have one darker yet. So you always go to the pile right above or below. So I'm not going to go back to my medium. I'm going to that first dark that I made, and then I can just easily get slightly darker. So I hope that you can see this value scale getting gradually lighter or darker depending on which direction you're coming from. I have them all in a row so that I can judge. So go ahead and mix the 4 values of gray, and then we'll apply them to our surface and we can start talking about light source. The brush that I would recommend that you start off with is a number 12 flat or filbert, and it should have short bristles on it because with oil painting, if you have long bristles, they just separate, and we're going to take short pulling strokes, and so you have to have a short brush that will allow you to do that. So number 12, a flat or filbert, works really well. This is an eye level still life. I'm getting a piece of tape, and I'm going to put that across the bottom. And what an eye level still life tells you is that every elliptical line is perfectly straight. So for example, we know that the top of this crock is a perfect circle, but because it's right at our eye level, it's not below, it's not above, it's just right at our eye level, all of those elliptical openings just go perfectly straight. So that is a great way to start if you're a beginner, because you don't have to worry about those oval openings. So if you put a piece of tape across, then you'll just have to worry about proper blending. The top section, as you can see from your final photo, is blue, and we're just going to work with gray down on the bottom, and that way we won't have to worry about color. We'll just worry about placement of value. Also blending. Now, because our light is coming from the upper 1/4, this is where our light value will go. Now, one thing that I want you to notice is how I loaded my brush. I loaded my brush holding it all the way back. You turn it over, and you load the opposite side, and you pull away from the pile. Don't just dab, 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 because then what happens is you don't have enough paint on your brush to actually apply. And you should be able to put enough paint down that the background is very easily covered. Now I'm going to wipe my brush, and there's a method to everything. You wipe your brush by pinching. And what you don't want to do is rock back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, because what that does is break all the hairs by the ferrule. Wipe by pinching. And this also gets your brush parallel again, because it might have gotten a little curved while you were blending. So I laid in that light value. Now watch as I lay in this medium value. Again, pulling out from the pile, loading both sides. And also notice how flat my brush is. If you're used to painting in acrylics upright, you just want to have your brush back and flat. And so I have my brush loaded with the medium value and back, flat, using all of the brush, not just the tip. But notice where I'm setting my brush down first. I'm setting my brush down first right in to that light value. Curving around. Now you can rotate your surface if you wish. I'm setting my brush partially into that light value, and then what that will afford us, wiping by pinching first, is the ability, no pressure on the brush, to come in and softly blend those values together. Now I'm not at all worried about brush strokes. That's something we can get out later. I'm just, with no pressure on the brush, just tickling the light and the medium together. Notice I'm not going across, I am going with the values. I used a lot of pressure. I'm going to continue to fill in that medium value area. I'm using a great deal of pressure to force it down into those acrylic pores, and it's a lot of pressure, but no pressure at all when I'm blending. Now, when you start to do this on your own, you do have in your information a value placement guide, and it'll show you exactly where to place these values, and it's all just based on that upper right-hand light source. Now, one thing that we need to talk about, how do you get that crisp outside edge? To get that crisp outside edge, and we've been talking about holding your brush back, to get that crisp outside edge, load your brush with the value that is in that section, which in this case is the medium value. And can you see my brush just scooting along? This is called walking the brush. And what this will do is it'll create that real crisp outside edge. And you always want to be working over your surface. So you'll notice when we do the other side, I'll rotate and have my brush over the surface, the opposite side when we do the left side. So now we have the medium value and the light value in. Wipe your brush by pinching every time you go back to your surface, if you've mingled with another value, that is. And now we're putting in the dark value. Now this is a big jump, but I'll show you some tricks on how to blend this. But notice I'm setting my brush slightly into that medium value. I am not putting it right next to, even worse yet, leaving a little acrylic gap. I'm setting my brush slightly in. Now you can walk your brush around this pair. I'll worry about that later. But you can turn and walk your brush just as we did before. Don't take it all the way down. Some of that will be your low dark, lower in value, lower in your palette, your darkest value. Now this is a big jump, and you can blend as we did before. Brush half on one value, half on the other, short pulling XY strokes with no pressure. But another thing that you can do is you can do the zigzag blend. And what that is I'm taking my brush and I'm just zigzagging back and forth. And then what I can do is come in, again, no pressure on the brush, and just blend. And what I did is I introduced some of the dark value into the medium and some of the medium into the dark. And now I can just easily blend those values together. I'm going to load my brush with my low dark value, which is the lowest on my palette, the darkest value of all. And this is where I'm going to rotate my surface so that I can walk and create that left outside edge. And I'm completely cognizant of the fact that this is wet, so I'm not going to lay my hand in it. But I'm just walking, scooting, pulling that brush along. And this only works if your brush is heavily loaded with paint. Otherwise it just leaves little pit marks. Now I can go ahead and fill in the rest with my low dark. Now you can't really see it, but I do have a piece of tape down at the bottom. You can use drafting, magic, scotch, anything that you have. But what that does is I can just get very sloppy down there. It just doesn't matter. But notice I'm filling in the rest, and I'm setting my brush slightly in, just ever so slightly into that dark value. Now I've blended as well as I can. So what you can do now, after you've blended as well as you can with your flat or your filbert, you can come in with your mop. And a mop is just a fluffy brush that's meant as a refining tool. I have the number 4 mop, and I'm just going to start in the dark area, and I'm pouncing and following the zones as I laid them down initially. And what this will do is it'll just, if I have any stubborn blending lines, it'll help break those down. Plus, since this is an interesting crock, it'll give it a nice, interesting surface patina. What you can't do is iron it back and forth. If you need to work your way back the other way, you just have to slowly work your way back. If you get a large buildup of paint on your brush, you can take it and pull it across your paper towel and remove. I don't know if you just saw that hair that was in, but I just went in at a low angle and scooped it out. And there we have a value scale of gray, creating the first stage of the lower section of our crock. Let's go ahead and put in the top blue section of our crock. I'm adding blue to our palette. Blue is a primary color. A primary color is a color that it means first, and it's a color that you cannot mix. It's a color that you have to actually obtain. All the other colors, some of the other colors, yellow and red, primaries you have to obtain, and as we go along you'll see that some of the colors you can mix. So I've put blue on the palette, and a great way to make blue lighter or darker is with white and black, but that's what we already have here. So what I'm going to do, because I wouldn't want these grays to go to waste, I'm going to add blue to each value of gray. And we'll be able to just take this value scale and alter it. Now again, a great way to make a value scale of blue is with black and white, because actually blue and black have a lot in common, because black is just a neutralized blue. So if you didn't have a value scale of gray already mixed, you could take and make white and black and add blue to it. Now, proportion-wise, how much should you add to each pile? You're going to have to add more to the darker piles to make it show up, and less to the lighter piles, because it'll show up much more easily. And it should look proportionally the same. This is much, much bluer than my lighter value, so I'm adding just a touch more blue to my lighter value. Wiping my knife each time I go back to that blue so it stays pure. I added a fair amount of the ultramarine blue to this dark pile, but it really didn't alter it much. What's very interesting with ultramarine blue, it looks like a very strong color. It's actually a pretty weak color. So that's something else to learn about your paint, which are the strong colors and which are the weak colors. And now you know that ultramarine blue is actually one of the weak colors, even though it looks like a quite potent one. And we'll talk about the chemistry of all the paints as we use them. Now, what if you get too much blue in your gray pile? Well, what you have to do is then mix more gray and add that to the overly blue pile. It's the only way out. So, the lesson to be learned there is add your blue little by little. And I think this is working out to be a pretty good scale. I think I could still have a little bit more blue in this dark. But they look like they're a unit, like they belong together. But think about blue. A blue value scale is best made with white and black, tinted with blue. Blue is a primary. It's a color that you can't mix. It's a cool color. And we also know that ultramarine blue is a weak color in terms of chemistry. All right, let's start painting on our surface. I'm going to noisily tape the very top of my crock so that we can just paint away. And you may wish to take your ruler and double check that your tape is perfectly straight, because we went through all that effort. And if your tape isn't perfectly straight, then of course your crock won't be. This is probably one of the last times we'll get to tape, because you can't tape on dried oil paint, heat set, Genesis. That's all just too tender. So this is our moment. Look how much bluer that looks next to our gray. Also, our background is fairly warm and it's bringing out all of the cool colors. But there is our light value. Now I'm going to place the medium value. Now notice the light value, because of our light source, stays on the right side of center. I'm going to turn this so that I can carefully create that outside edge. Now if you end up getting outside of the lines, I'll show you a few ways to take care of that. So don't worry yet. There's ways to fix that. I'm going to put this back upright so that I can blend correctly. Again, watch that you're not cross-blending. You have to be sure that you're following the values. So medium value here, light value, no pressure, and just melting those values together. Now I can go on to my first dark. Remember, D stands for dark, which is the dark that's next to the medium value on your palette. And a really easy way to remember it is if a value is next to a value on your palette, it can be blended and sit next to a value on your surface. So in other words, low dark cannot touch medium. Light cannot touch low dark, because they're not next to each other on the palette and they didn't grow from each other. If you skip a value, that's when you get mud. Just going to double check my blending. It's a nice smooth transition. I'm going to take up this tape. I love to pull up the tape because then you can see what you really have, and it just makes it so much nicer and neater. Now we can do the lower section. The question at this point, if you were in a class, you would probably say, how do I keep my hand out of it? Well, don't put your hand in it. That's the only option, because there really is no trick. You just have to not rest your hand. You just have to at all times assume everything is wet. And I know that probably wasn't the answer you were hoping for, but that is the truth. There's the light value, and I'm going to point out things as they become relevant, but notice the shape of the light value. Light values are always the shape of the form. The light value up at the top was more of a rectangular shape. This is more of an oval shape, as was the light down below. Getting slightly darker with the medium value. Now you don't have to be absolutely perfect where these values meet, because we're actually going to come in and blend them slightly. So now I have in my light value and my medium value. Turning to create that nice, neat outside edge by walking the brush. Now if these values run together, that's okay. We'll separate them. And constantly rotating your surface is not a bad thing. Now I'm going to move on to my first dark. Again, a lot of pressure when I'm laying this in, and then virtually no pressure while blending. And now I'm going to put in that low dark outside edge. This looks pretty. Blending. Now I'm just going to blend ever so slightly where these values meet. Generally in pottery, this is a glaze that's put on and it runs down, so it's not absolutely perfect. So you don't want it to end up perfect, because it just naturally would not be, and it's much more interesting if it's just slightly blended. I'm going to take the tape off of the bottom. And this is what I'm checking for now at this point. I'm checking for ridges. And if you have a ridge, what you will do is you can take a single ply of tissue or a paper towel, and you're going to lay it across your surface, and wherever you see a ridge, just take your mop and run it across that ridge, and that should blot it up. Because if you have a ridge, you're going to always have a ridge, so you want to blot up any ridges. I think that we can go ahead and dry this, and we will start on our next primary color, which is our yellow in the yellow pear. I have put out 3 new colors on the palette. Raw Sienna, which is a neutral color. It's a very dull yellow. Genesis Yellow, which is the next of our primaries. And then Burnt Umber, which is also a neutral in the yellow-orange family, and is just a darker yellow that we will be using. So go ahead and lay those values out at the top of your palette, and let's start mixing for the pear. Now, the pear is our next secondary color, our next primary color, which is yellow. And again, it's a color that you can't mix. It's primary, it's first. Now, in general, you probably will not use a color just straight out of the container. You have to neutralize it in some way. And that's why we have the neutrals or the earth tones on our palette. And a great way to neutralize yellow is with just a little bit of raw sienna. And what that does is it just takes that intensity, the brightness out of the yellow so that we could use it for our pear. Now, we want to have, just as we had before, we're going to have one light and two darks. So there is our first yellow, which is our medium value. Now we want to get a little bit darker. So I took, again, about a fourth of my medium value. And to get darker, I'm going to add a darker yellow. Before, when we got darker with blue, what we basically added was black. We can't add black to yellow because it will go green. So we have to add a darker yellow, which is the raw sienna. And you just want to add enough raw sienna that it becomes a darker golden brown. Trying to avoid the grayscale. Now I'm going to take a little bit of my dark value, move it down on my palette. I think I'll add just a little bit more raw sienna to it to make it darker, but that's not going to be quite dark enough, so I'm going to also add just, you see that, just a dot of burnt umber. And now I have three yellows. The two darkers are golden yellow. And what happens with the value scale, and you can really see it with yellow, you're going to go from light to dark, which we did on the other scale, bright to dull. Let's have one lighter. Now we can make it lighter by adding white. That's definitely going to make it lighter, but it's also making it a little bit duller, and we just agreed that we had to get brighter. And I'm going to make it a little bit lighter with the white, but always think of white as bleach. And so since we just bleached the yellow out of it, what can we do? We can add a little bit of yellow back in. And now that makes that just much more usable for a yellow scale. Light, medium, dark, and low dark. This time I'm going to work with a smaller brush because we're working with a smaller object. This is a size 8 filbert. You can use again, a flat or a filbert. And let's start working on this pear. We'll work each section separately. This is a sphere shape, also known as a ball, and that's the kind of volume that it has. It's very round. Again, notice the highlight, and let's work with this sphere independently of the other section. And so the highlight is very round, and it's in the upper right, and it's above the center line. I'm going to place the medium value, and everything that we talked about before is valid. You want to be sure that your brush is half on one value, half on the other as you apply this paint, so that you can just very easily blend the sections together. Now you'll rotate your surface and then come in and just coax the values together. Don't cross blend. The medium value is the value when you look at the object you say, oh, that's the color of the pear. And so I think that color is fine. Get that outside edge. But just keep in mind that your medium value is the local color, the mass tone, the color that you think, oh, that looks good. That's the color of my pear. So if yours is too brown or too bright, it's your medium value that you will adjust. So there is my light and my medium. Now, what happens with a dark value on a sphere is it forms a crescent. And the crescent starts at the top, and the large belly of the sphere casts a shadow onto itself. And so that is why you have all of this dark curving underneath. Now I can come in with my low dark and it's maybe difficult to tell, but I have tape there, that's why I'm being so cavalier. I just blend these values together, and it's the combination of having the light in the upper 1/4 and having the crescent of dark. Notice that it starts on the top left and curves all the way over onto that right side. Fortunately, we have a chance to repeat our sphere knowledge when we do our red cherry, but we also can do it on this other little sphere shape. So we have light in the upper 1/4. We have medium value. Then I'll drop down one and use the dark that's right below medium. And then I'll put on the low dark, forming that crescent, curving up. Now we don't want, kind of looks like a yellow snowman at this moment, which is not a very pleasant thought. So let's blend where these values come together. Maybe even straighten that out a little bit, because we want a little bit of an indentation, but we don't want it as crisp as two spheres on top of each other. So now we have our yellow pear in, and we know how to make a sphere, light in the upper 1/4, the crescent of dark. And to make yellow, a yellow value scale, you work with yellow, and then with the darker yellows that are on our palette, raw sienna and burnt umber. Let's move on to red. I've added 2 more paints to the palette, the Genesis Red in the quinacridone crimson. If you're using traditional oils, it's alizarin crimson is what you could use here. This is our third primary. It's a true red, and it will allow us to create yet another value scale. We're going to paint a cherry, and with this value scale, I'm going to start with the medium value. You may have noticed I cleared out a little space there, and we probably could use that red just as is, but let's make it a little bit of a darker red just to stay truer to the cherry color. Now to make it darker, we have to use a darker red on our palette. If we used black, it would get too dull, and so that's our logical choice. So this is a good medium value. Again, I'm going to take and split off and move about 1/4 of it down on my palette. And to get darker, again, using our darker red, which is the Quin Crimson. This is a very true, clear red violet. And it takes reds and makes them darker, duller, cooler, without going too dull. Like I said, if our other choice would be black or burnt umber, but this goes darker but stays in the red family. Now we want to go a little bit darker yet. Splitting that off, wiping my knife, and I'm going to get a little bit more of the crimson. And now it's darker, it's a little duller, and it's cooler. So a nice scale. Now, to get lighter, I'm going to get a little bit more medium value going here first. But I'm going to take a portion of my medium value. Now what if we added white to this red? It would go pink. What we want it to do is we want it to go lighter, brighter, and warmer. And so the most logical choice is yellow, because yellow will warm it, yellow will lighten it, and it will brighten it. It's gone to the orange side, and that's exactly what we needed it to do. So to me it's very interesting with this red scale. What we actually have is red going to orange, and then red going to red violet, and then going to, we could add a little blue to this, and this would be a true violet. And so with a red scale where you want it to stay in the family, what you do is you work that side of the color wheel. So look at your color wheel, and you'll notice that these are all reds right next to each other. And that's what you can use when you create a red scale, is that side of the color wheel, the warm side of the color wheel. Let's paint our cherry. I would drop down to about a size 4 flat or filbert. I'm going to noisily put a piece of tape under there. And then we can just paint away. Let's start with my light value just to make sure I get that in the upper section. And this is just a repeat of what we did on our pear, because we have light and it's round, it's in the upper 1/4, and now we have medium surrounding that light. The first dark, creating a crescent shape, and I think we can actually put some on the right outside edge. blending with the brush, half on one value, half on the other, just coaxing those values together. And then finally coming in with the low dark. And adding that strong crescent of dark, going from, if you think of it as a clock, from 11 o'clock till 4 o'clock. And blending those values together. And something this small, what you have to watch out for is that your low dark doesn't touch your light, your medium doesn't touch your low dark, that everything has that buffer. You don't want your low dark to touch your medium. I'm going to pull off my bad looking piece of tape, and there's my cherry. So we've worked through red, yellow, and blue, all of our primaries. We just have our handles to do, and then we'll have stage 1 finished. We're going to make the handles brown just to help repeat some of the colors from down below up above. And so I'm just going to work with our earth tones and basing in the handle with burnt umber, remembering that walking of the brush. So I'll turn it anytime I need to have a nice crisp straight edge. I'm working with the 8, but you could work with a smaller brush. Now on the inside of the handle, where it's away from the light source, that's where I'm going to place black. And again, what this will do is we're working truly with neutralized yellows, and so it's going to repeat the yellow of the pear, the stem, and just add just an interesting touch to this section. And then through the center of the handle, place raw sienna. I'll let this real quick. Through the center, place raw sienna. Don't let it touch the outside edge. And do the same on the other handle, and dry everything and get ready for the second stage.